machine learning line bundle cohomology.
So let's see. Okay, I think you can hear me. Well, thanks first of all to the organizers for inviting me here to speak about this work. Also, thanks for getting up so early. Yeah, it's basically about a paper that I did in collaboration with another PhD student in the group of Ralf Blumenhagen in Munich, which is Lorenz, who is also with us here. Yeah, so this was basically our start into machine learning and string theory. So I hope I can also give you a sort of overview of how we approach the subject and how our project went, and we'll also show you some unsuccessful attempts. So it's the outline for the talk. So first, I will give you my biased perspective on machine learning the landscape and machine learning the swampland. And because that is really my area of expertise, I think. And then I will talk to you about a specific landscape problem of computing line bundle cohomology. Many people also in the audience here have worked on machine learning cohomology groups. But yeah, we'll see that our approach was a bit different and led also to some interesting results. So first, then I will show you the traditional approach to computing line bundle cohomology. I will not go into too many details here. The interesting thing is not really how we generate the data, but the analysis. And then I will also show you the machine learning approach and how the traditional approach is needed in order to give you a certain data set in the first place from which you can then extrapolate using our methods. So as also a few people at this conference has emphasized, the landscape is very vast. So we have the classic estimate for the number of type 2b flux vacuum, which is some large exponential number, and it's a lower bound clearly. And we've seen also some much larger numbers in the exponent here. In this case, for F-theory flux vacuum on a single elliptically fibered Calabi-Yau. So this is also certainly a lower bound. So this is really a vast number that we are dealing with. And clearly a proof of the finiteness of flux vacuum doesn't even exist up to now. The closest that people have come to this is probably the F-theory people who have studied elliptically fibered Calabi-Yau threefolds. And it was shown in the early 90s that their number is actually finite. And quite recently, actually 2017, 2018, people have realized that maybe in some sense most of all of the Calabi-Yau threefolds are in fact elliptically fibered, at least for large Hodge numbers.
Just a comment is that this statement, the fourth bullet point, is known for fourfolds now also. So
there's
a result from like 2 years ago, which is sort of the equivalent of the Gross and Grassi result for fourfolds, which is great. So,
yeah, it's amazing, yeah. It's amazing work, I agree. But yeah, also we believe that the landscape is only a tiny subset of the swampland. So let me explain these notions. So the string landscape is basically the set of effective field theories that we can get from a string vacuum, so from a consistent string construction, whereas the string swampland is basically the complement in the space of effective field theories. And also in the past, well, let's say 10 to 20 years, people have increasingly realized that there are some properties that we expect from string theory to arise generically, and these are known as the Swampland conjectures, which are conjectured properties of theories that arise from string theory. So these constraints really are what defines this boundary here, and so it's interesting to figure these constraints out and scrutinize the evidence for them, and yeah, many things have been done. So we expect that the standard model is, of course, in the landscape somewhere. Yeah, but we haven't found it, obviously. So this is a slide that I actually showed at String Phenomenology 2018, this year in July. So the slide is not really that important. The important thing is really the difference to the status that we have now. That's what I want to show you. So these are some of the Swampland conjectures that people have considered, and very central among these is the weak gravity conjecture, which is also I guess, the most solid one that people claim to understand the best. So quite recently there's also been some attention to this de Sitter conjecture that the gradient of the scalar potential in the string compactification has to be in Planck units bigger than some order 1 number times the potential itself, which would exclude de Sitter vacua. So quite a provocative statement. So that's also why people were so interested in this. Yeah, so this is basically the status of July this year. And well, I tried to complete this to the picture how it is now in December, I think. So people have really worked a lot on this de Sitter conjecture because, I mean, it's clearly a crucial thing. We need to understand if de Sitter can arise in string theory. So people have figured out this refinement of this conjecture, which is also related to another conjecture here in some way. But there's also some work from other people who have considered other refinements of this conjecture, all of which, or most of which would exclude de Sitter solutions. Also, I just published a paper with Aaron Palti and Dieter Lüst about massive spin 2 states in string theory. So you can see that all of these conjectures are really interconnected, and it's important to understand the relations between and the evidence for them. Because this clearly cuts down the size of the effective field theory that we have to look at in string theory. Okay, so what are some problems of the landscape type, how I would call it? So we study often a map from some integral vector to some other integral vector, which is in principle highly nonlinear. So this input here, this input vector could be some geometric data, some fluxes, some vector bundles that we have, or some brain wrappings, for example. And the list continues. And then we look at some properties of vacua. So is our vacuum supersymmetric? What is the gauge group of a vacuum? So this is what we are really interested in. And then the task is really to understand this map. So some possible questions, well, possible, maybe not feasible. So this might be feasible. Classify inequivalent input data for some classes of these maps. Clearly less feasible is a standard model problem. So we have the standard model somewhere in the landscape. This is what I call X here. Maybe we're interested in some neighborhood of the standard model in the string landscape, and we want to find pre-images of points in this neighborhood. Okay, this is clearly a challenging task. So basically, how do we find the standard model in string theory? Also a very interesting development that has also had some interest here at the conference is finding approximate parameter distributions that realistically emulate the distribution that is found in string vacua. So for example, I think it's very important to get a proxy of a realistic Kähler metric that we can use for simulating, in a sense, stringy data. So what are some problems that I would call problems of the Swampland type? Well, the Swampland conjectures are mostly of the form, we have a bound on a certain quantity in the landscape, so we have some quantity Q here, which depends on this input vectors that I defined here, which is claimed to be less than order 1 number. Or we have some property which is strictly excluded. So for example here, if we have a non-supersymmetric ADS vacuum, people have claimed that it is necessarily unstable. So this is also something that we can check. So we can check for correlations in the data set. Does a certain quantity imply certain other quantities? So that would be very interesting. Possible questions here are, can we violate these bounds parametrically? Okay, this is maybe not a task for machine learning, but more something that we have to understand analytically. So we have to just better our understanding of these bounds and if there is actually any evidence for them or not. And if we believe they... this is supposed to be an AND, yeah. So if we were sufficiently certain about one of these Swampland conjectures, then the next question is maybe can we bend it? So do we have a set of constructions that we believe are consistent? And in this setup, can we bend it? What exactly is this order 1 number? So clearly for large field inflation, for example, it's important how large precisely the scalar field displacements are that we can get in string theory consistently. Yeah, so this is certainly a question. And also how likely is it that the inequality is approximately saturated? So in this landscape picture here, this is the question, how are the string vector basically distributed at this border in comparison to the bulk of the landscape? So how likely is it, in a sense, to almost violate these conjectures? It's also interesting. Of course, this is not like decoupled from the landscape type thinking. These two types of problems are clearly interrelated. And yeah, figuring out the evidence for these Swampland conjectures, I repeat it again, is very important to give generic predictions for string theory, just as it is important to figure out the distribution of string vector. Okay, so now I'm going to get a bit more concrete. So for those of you who are not experts on toric varieties, toric varieties are a great arena to study Calabi-Yau manifolds, and Calabi-Yau manifolds arise as certain hypersurfaces in toric varieties. The prototype of a toric variety is really just complex projective space with some homogeneous coordinates xi to x capital I here, x1 to x capital I. And the prototype Calabi-Yau, for many people, is the first one that they see in their lives, is the quintic hypersurface, a very simple thing in complex projective space. And this is really the picture that you should have of a toric variety. In general, one can describe them in terms of a set of homogeneous coordinates with some scaling relations. So in the case of the projective space, this is just the homogeneous rescaling of all the coordinates. And one example that we will look at in the following is not a Calabi-Yau threefold, but a Calabi-Yau twofold, which is the K3 surface, which we will embed in a weighted projective space of this form here. So this is if we cure the singularities of this, we get a toric variety given by these homogeneous coordinates and with these rescalings here. And the thing that we want to study really is line bundles on the Calabi-Yau. And I will show you on one of the next slides why we want to study them. Now I would just want to give you some intuition of how line bundles look on these spaces. So it is a fact that line bundles are the same as divisors. Divisors are, you can think of them as codimension 1 subspaces. And any line bundle L here on a toric variety is really given in terms of the structure sheaf on the toric variety OX by some integers. So we have some divisors, which are just, in this case, just the vanishing sets of some coordinates. So these are equivalent under a certain equivalence relation. And we have, in this case, two linearly independent divisors. So any divisor can be expanded in these two. And basically, our line bundles are defined by two integers. This is really the only crucial thing here. So a line bundle for us is basically a set of two integers in this setting. In general, it will be more than two integers, but it's a set of integers. Okay, so why do we study line bundle cohomology? If we compactify the heterotic string or consider F theory, then we're interested in the cohomology groups of some line bundles, or more generally vector bundles, on the Calabi-Yau itself or some submanifold of it. And very generally, these HI count massless modes in the resulting effective field theory. Then, and in string theory and F theory, they also count chiral fermions in particular. So that's, of course, very interesting if you want to get a standard model. But for us, they really simply define a map of integers to integers, and that's what we want to study. So I would call the dimensions of the cohomology groups here little hi, and we study the dimensions of the cohomology groups of some line bundles given by some integers. The dimensions, so I runs here from I to the dimension of the space that we look at. It's just a vector of integers, and also this entry here is just a vector of integers. So it's really a map of the type that I discussed before. Okay. So what is the traditional approach? Well, there's toric varieties are in a certain sense well suited to be analyzed by algorithms, because they're really combinatorical in a sense. And several algorithms are known for the computation of these line bundle cohomology groups. In various cases, also exact formulae for the toric variety are known. Here I have a formula for the projective space, for example. Not so much is in fact known for hypersurfaces in terms of analytic formulae, I think. And there have been also in 2018 some analytic results for complete intersections in products of projective spaces, which is a different topic. But there's also a construction of Calabi-Yau manifolds. And yeah, this is clearly something that one is interested in, because if we find an analytic expression, we don't have to go through these algorithms and waste computing time. For complex projective space, I've shown you here the dimension of the zeros cohomology group. This is really just a binomial coefficient. So if k is negative, this clearly is just 0, or there's no meaningful value to assign anything other than that to it. In fact, these cohomology groups vanish if k is less than 0. We have a single integer here labeling the line bundles on CPN. And if k is not negative, then this is just a polynomial of degree n. So work out the binomial coefficient, you see that? And this is something that you should keep in mind for some of the later slides. So often these cohomology groups are just polynomials. Very simple. And well, for practical computations of these cohomologies, we use the Cohom-Kalk algorithm by Ralf Blumhagen, Joke Riemann-Roch. And there are, of course, many other algorithms, but this is the particular one that we used. And this, in the first instance, computes the cohomology of line bundles on the toric variety itself, not on the Calabi-Yau, which lies in there. So then the next step is you have the line bundles on the toric ambient space, and you have to go to the Calabi-Yau itself. And this is the topic of this slide here. So this is the most complicated slide I think I have here in terms of math, but it's also, the procedure is actually quite simple. So the line bundles that you have on the ambient space, they actually pull back to the hypersurface. So every line bundle on the ambient space defines you also a line bundle on the hypersurface. So X is for me the toric variety, and H is the hypersurface. And since the hypersurface is codimension 1, it itself is a divisor. So what I write here is meaningful. You can subtract D and H because it divises from a group. And there is an exact sequence here, which is known as a causal sequence, which relates line bundles on the toric variety itself and a hypersurface in there, which is given by H. So this is the one that we want to compute the cohomologies of. And these are the ones that are given to us by the Cohom-Kalk algorithm. Okay, this is a nice sequence here of line bundles. And it induces a long exact sequence of cohomology groups of these line bundles. And the idea is now to solve this sequence. So we're interested in the dimensions of these cohomology groups. And how does it work? Well, every time you have a 0 in here, you cut the sequence because you get two exact sequences in this way. And you use the fact that the alternating sum of dimensions in an exact sequence, which starts by 0, ends by 0, is just 0. So you get a system of linear equations which you can solve, hopefully, and then you get the line bundle cohomologies on the hypersurface in terms of the toric ambient space cohomologies. And if this procedure does not give a unique result, you need to actually calculate these maps and their images and kernels, but you can also do this. And in this way, you get then the cohomologies on the Calabi-Yau. Okay, fine. So now we have our map from line bundles, which are given by integers, to cohomology dimensions, which are also integers. So this is the data. This is for a toric variety, not for a Calabi-Yau. It's known as the Petzl surface. And you can clearly see that it looks polynomial here and here. Yeah, but there's also like a diagonal line here where it looks constant. So there's clearly some different regions here in this plot. And it's in fact not trivial to to figure. So in this case, it's actually fairly trivial to figure out the analytic formula for the cohomologies. But in general, for a hypersurface, it's not trivial. So this is an example of a hypersurface. This is the K3 that I was talking about. Well, it looks very similar. One thing to notice is that here M is the M and N are really the integers that define the line bundle, and you can see that the entries on the axis here, which describes the cohomology group, the dimension of it, looks like it's quadratic in these integers. So turns out that this is because this hypersurface is of complex dimension 2. So if you have a higher complex dimension manifold that you're looking at, then you will also get not a quadratic expression, but higher degree polynomials, basically. So these numbers can grow quite quickly. So the interesting thing is now for us that we want to calculate a subregion here, a small region around the origin, and the question is now to extrapolate, how can we extrapolate from this to infinity, basically. So we don't want to compute everything here, just want to compute a small subset, and then hopefully we are able to extrapolate this to infinity. Yes?
Can you remind us what the definitions of M and N are?
M and N is, so line bundles are given by divisors, and I expand these divisors in some basis, and this defines me some integers. Okay, fine. So this is the data that we want to analyze. So in principle, we can just use some approaches that people also have tried in the literature, which is to use a neural network to reproduce this. So the first one is a classifier neural network, and the other one is a more kind of a regression. So in the first case, we have as input again our line bundle integers, and output are the cohomology dimensions, but we only look at a specific cohomology here, which is the zeros one. And then we bin the data. So if the cohomology dimension is 1, we put it on this output. If the cohomology dimension is 2, we put it on this output, and so on and so on. And then we have to impose a cutoff, and all cohomologies which are larger than a certain number are binned in the last bin. Okay, and then you try to run a classification. So the output is then the probability of the class membership here, and one has to cut off at some number. So this doesn't really help in extrapolating. So you might get some decent results in actually reproducing the cohomology in a given range of m's, but yeah, you cannot extrapolate this. The other option is to perform a regression. So there we don't only look at one cohomology group, not the zeros one only, but all of them together. And the outputs of our neural network are then actually the HI itself. So the aim is then to perform a regression to train this neural network to reproduce these numbers. And what you do is you round the result to the next integer. And in this case, you're not limited in this way that you don't impose a cutoff on the allowed cohomology dimensions. So this output could be any number in principle, but again, what we found is that your ability to extrapolate is limited by the float precision used. So because these numbers grow really big, if you go out of your training data, then you will not get accurate results. What is good is that you can actually make use of correlations between the different HI in this approach also. This helps a bit. Okay, so we did mostly the regression approach. So this is again the data, and so this is basically, this plot is not in our paper, but I produced it before the conference because I didn't have a plot. It took me 2 minutes. So this is really like it's also, I didn't put a lot of effort in this slide here because this is like, for us it was the bad approach. It didn't work. So it doesn't really matter how much effort I put in this. You will never get 100% accuracy here, and you will always fail at extrapolation. That is at least what we found. So what we did here is I took 3 fully connected layers and 100 neurons each. So data set was around 6,000-7,000 points. And well, I used 60% of them for training, put it on my desktop CPU for 2 minutes. and this is the result basically. And I got 50% accuracy in reproducing the cohomology groups, which is okay. But for example, it's easy to learn these zeros here. This is very easy. So we tried this with a bit more sophisticated approaches, like more sophisticated preprocessing of the data, and also tweaking a bit the neural network architectures that we had. But we never got significantly better. So maybe we got 80% accuracy. But depends also on what you're looking at. If you look at the toric variety itself, and this is actually fairly easy to learn, you can get maybe 98% accuracy, fairly easily actually. Turns out that if you look at a hypersurface, so at a Calabi-Yau, then actually the results are much worse. And this is partly because of some high-frequency modulation that we found in the data, and I will explain to you later.
But when you trained it, you didn't give it the normal bundle, or, I mean, you just gave it the integers?
Yes, only the integers.
Yeah, so it cannot know that, I mean, the neural network doesn't have the information to actually do the causal sequence.
No, it doesn't, of course. Yeah. Oh, this is also one reason why it fails, yeah. In a sense.
So it could just be failing for that reason.
But I think the approach is just, in general, not very promising because the computation, at least for a hypersurface, the computation is actually fairly quick using one of the classical algorithms for this. And, well, at least we found that it fails at extrapolation because we get basically the dimensions grow large if we go out in the integer space, and then the float precision limits us. That's what we found.
I mean, sometimes, of course, the float, I mean, the integers are cut off by tadpole cancellation.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, it's very interesting It's very interesting mathematically to know these and to know the precise conditions. But sometimes it might be enough to just know them in a range, because these integers for string compactification usually cannot grow indefinitely.
Yeah, for string compactifications, I agree completely. But if one is more generally interested in it, then yeah. Okay. So let me summarize the problems of this approach. So it worked for simple examples. For example, this Del Pezzo surface or other toric varieties, it worked quite well actually. Even with this naive approach, don't need to put in much work there. But for hypersurface, we actually have to go through this causal sequence, then it actually fails. It doesn't fail badly, but it fails in a way. We'll see later that it's partly due to some high-frequency oscillation in the data, which is not easy to fit. And also, as I said, to the finite float precision that we use. So we can kind of reproduce the data in this fixed M range, but if we want to extrapolate, go to large M, then this doesn't work this way. So the question then obviously is, can we do better? And the obvious answer is then always, if you understand your data, then you can do better than just putting a neural network on it. So let's try to understand our data. So this is what leads us to the Hirzebruch-Riemann-Roch theorem, which is a classic result. So there's actually an analytic expression here for the Euler characteristic of these line bundles, and this is just the alternating sum of these HI. So basically you take the trace of the output vector with some signs, and this is then known to be a polynomial of degree, which is the dimension of the toric variety or the hypersurface that we look at. So actually this is quite nice. So if we take the alternating sum of all the outputs, then we just get a polynomial. That is easy, I mean. So it's kind of reasonable to expect that also locally the data is described by a polynomial, and this is also what we have seen before.
You mean locally in MN space?
Right, locally in MN space, in the input space. So locally the cohomologies are, we have seen this individually also polynomial of degree at most the dimension, and there are then pairwise discontinuities or kinks in the cohomology groups which cancel out the Euler characteristic. So a closer look at the data then shows that maybe we should figure out what this line is, this line, and this line, and then cut the space of inputs into these three regions here, and then simply do a polynomial fit. Well, it's not that simple, really, actually, it turns out. So visually, indeed, it's described by a polynomial locally. That's what we've seen. And we want to identify these faces, which are naively just these three here. So we look really at locations where our map from the input integers to the output integers is discontinuous or has a kink. So we want to detect this. These places where the function is not differentiable anymore. And naively, we will get then a cone structure in the space of inputs. We classify these cones and then associate polynomial fits to them, and then we solve the problem.
These kinks are happening away from zero. Some of them look like they're on zero, but some of them are away from zero cohomology. Is that right? Yeah, there's a kink right there.
This is zero here.
Yeah, that's zero, but the one going up and to the left, that kink is happening away from zero cohomology.
This here?
Yeah.
No, it's not. It's just an artifact of the plot.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so
if you project it in the MN plane here, then it's just a line from the origin.
But it need not be.
Hmm?
I mean, this is true for this particular case.
Yes, yes.
I mean, the cones don't need to start at zero. They're Kodaira vanishing and so on, so they are not always cones that go out from zero. It happens to be in this case.
There can be points on the kink where the cohomology is not zero. That's the,
yes.
Okay, that was my question. Yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah. So clearly you also need to choose a large enough set that you generate where you can detect actually all of the kinks in the data. Okay, so to detect this cone structure, then we just use unsupervised learning and do a polynomial fit. Okay, it's easy, we solved the problem. Yeah, this cone structure is actually not quite what happens, and we'll see this in one of the next slides. But first, let me explain you the algorithm that we used. Well, the polynomials are of degrees at most d, which is the dimension of the space that we look at. So at the phase boundaries where we have the kinks, only there the d plus first derivative of the data is non-zero. This is crucial. So we run a classification on this data set. We take the space of inputs here and also their d plus first derivatives in all of the variables that we have. And then...
Derivatives, you mean finite difference?
Right, finite difference is how we compute them. Yeah. And the idea is that this then separates the data into one large interior class, which has many points, and the boundary class, which consists of the locations of the kinks. Because what this will do is just classify all of the interior points, which have this here all zero, into one big set, and then one big set where the derivatives don't vanish. That's the idea.
And these derivatives are finite distance derivatives.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so then you get rid of the boundary classes. So in this picture, you throw out the red lines, and then you run an additional classification on not the d plus first derivatives, but the d's derivatives, which are then the leading order of the polynomial, basically. And this is different in every phase. This is the idea. So you run a second classification on the m's and the d's derivatives. And this then classifies you the different polynomial phases from each other. Okay. So how we did this practically, we used actually Mathematica 11.3. Well, we tried to use neural network for this, but it was not really a promising approach. You can just use k-means clustering to cluster the data into these different classes, and it worked really well, actually. And this cluster classify functions, what we use it with a method k-means and performance goal quality. This is the Mathematica slang. And then we use a linear model fit to fit a polynomial. It's really simple. Okay, this is how it worked out in one of the examples. This is now again the Hirzebruch surface, the toric variety itself. So this works quite nicely, as we can see. We have a cut here, and we get a cut diagonally. Yeah. So, and then I didn't show you the polynomial fits, but then each phase you just fit a polynomial. Be a bit careful that you actually get out rational coefficients for your polynomial in the end, so it makes sense, because you want to get out integers again. Yeah. So in this case, there's not much to see here. It works really nicely. We have these two outliers here, which did not get thrown out properly. But yeah, these are just 2 points. So compared to the infinite set of points that we classified correctly.
So the 2 points were on the, they are not on the boundary, they were,
They should have been classified into the boundary class, I think. But they didn't go into there.
B plus derivative vanishes?
Yeah, it's just a miracle coincidence. These lie exactly at the boundary of 3 phases and they exactly cancel out. So the final difference with the calculator is 0, and this is why it's single points.
Yeah. Yeah. So next example would be an actual hypersurface. And now we find something interesting. In this region here, we thought this is just made out of 3 regions and 3 cones. But in this region here, we find actually a kind of Z2 modulation. So the polynomial that we get depends on whether the integer is even or odd. And this is actually something that happens generically for hypersurfaces. So what the neural network did before is it just fitted right through this. So because it doesn't care if the polynomial is rational coefficients or real coefficients. The easy thing is just to lay a fit through this because the difference is really small. So these jumps are maybe of order 1, I think. They also occur with very high frequency, so it's very easy to to minimize the loss function by just putting a fit through it in the middle. Yeah. The same happens here, I think. Yeah. So the regression with the neural network did not really achieve this separation into these 2 alternating phases here. And since they're a generic feature, then one can either take this into account by maybe adjusting the neural network that one uses, or our algorithm naturally classifies these into 2 different phases and fit 2 different polynomials, and it works.
Is this H0?
It should be H0, yeah.
Does it also happen for H1 and H2?
Yeah. In this case, at least it happens for H1, yes. Mm-hmm. So of course, because in the alternating... Sorry?
Then it also happens for H2.
I guess so. Because in the alternating sum, it has to cancel out in the end. Yeah. Okay. So this is another one. This is another hypersurface in another projective space that we looked at. So this is the case 3. It was 2-dimensional. Again, here on the cohomology dimension here, the axis, we see that this is quadratic in the inputs, and now we look at a dimension 3 example where it's cubic. So one again sees a Z2 modulation here. And yeah, here you already see that maybe the data set that we generated was a bit small. It did work, but yeah, these classes here, the higher the dimension, you throw out more boundary points because of the finite difference. So the number of boundary points here that you throw out gets larger, and you might need a larger set of inputs for your clustering in the beginning. But in this case, it still worked. And you can also see that here we have 2 different classes, also with this Z2 modulation, which doesn't seem necessary here because all these points are at 0 actually, and it's actually the case. But this is also the case, because we classified all of the cohomologies at the same time, so it just means that some other cohomologies jump here. This is only H0, and some of the other HIs jump there. Okay. But it doesn't really matter. I mean, in the end, you can then reduce again the number of phases by hand, but or you can just run it all on one of the H's, only on H0, then you will not get this, I think. Yeah. Okay, so what we did is then we fitted polynomials with rational coefficients. This is important if you want to extrapolate the data. If this is just some float number, then for large values of the input integers, you will reproduce non-integral outputs. And clearly, if you fit the wrong rational number, then this is also bad. So it's good to perform a consistency check. So you actually compute the alternating sum of the cohomology groups and check this with the Hirzebruch-Riemann-Roch result. And this worked nicely. then it's a strong indication that the result is correct. Here, for the case 3 hypersurfaces, these are the different phases and polynomials for H0, H1, H2. And this is what we calculate for the Euler characteristic from Hirzebruch-Riemann-Roch. So you can clearly see here, alternating sum is just the same. And then maybe let's look at one of the others here. This one, this 3m here. There's no term linear in m here. 3m cancels with this 3m in the alternating sum, for example.
Are these for all values of m and n, or are there walls in this one too?
Well, the walls are captured by these different phases here.
Sorry, yes, of course.
Yeah. But in the walls themselves, you also fit it? In this case, we didn't even try to figure out what they are. But in principle, yes, you can fit them. Yeah, and we did this in one example, and you can actually get some formula for m and n, some condition. But yeah, in this case, I mean, it's not really necessary for us because you can just put it into this classifier function and you will get out the correct class and the correct polynomial. Just if you want to have the full analytic result, then you have to figure out also, of course, what are the relations for these boundaries. It's a good question. Okay, so what are some possible generalizations? We have looked at line bundles, but one is also interested in vector bundles, for example. And these can, for example, be constructed here in such a co-kernel construction, implicitly in terms of line bundles. So these are all line bundles defined in terms of integers. And, well, U is then a vector bundle, which is basically just the quotient of the two here. And again, so this bundle is again determined in terms of a set of integers, and one could in principle look if this still works in this case. Would be interesting to figure this out. We haven't done it so far. And another possibility is also to check not only hypersurfaces, but higher codimension subspaces, so complete intersections. This is also important for F-theory matter, for example. And yeah, people have done this only for complete intersections in products of projective spaces. This is the paper that I mentioned in the beginning. So also these analytic results, they found this by hand, basically. But yeah, we can also check it here. We just didn't do it yet. And well, as I say, the results from the literature, this is in the case of complete intersections in products of projective spaces. There we get an indication already that this polynomial behavior will still be there. And I think it's also expected from Hirzebruch-Riemann-Roch that locally the data is polynomial. Okay, so conclusions. Well, the first part of the talk, I think it's very important to understand these Swampland constraints properly. And the question is, can we use machine learning for that? It's not clear because there's more serious doubts on these claims than just checking them in some examples. And, we focused here on computing line bundle cohomologies, which I classified as one of the landscape type approaches to the string landscape. And we showed that neural networks fail in many respects if we want to compute these line bundle cohomologies. And we proposed our alternative algorithm to classify these phase boundaries and fit polynomials instead. And it's actually exciting that we find analytic expressions with some rational coefficients that would be interesting to understand also. So we don't know how to compute these. So in Hirzebruch-Riemann-Roch, you just compute some intersection numbers, but how these rational numbers arise, it's not clear to us. Maybe it's clear to some of you who've worked on this a bit more. One thing that I still have here is the following. I've seen this in a newspaper. So people have looked at the visual system of a fruit fly. And so this is what is depicted here. And they basically try to reproduce it with a neural network and see what comes out. So this is the input. So fruit flies have a very bad vision, also because their eye is so primitive. So this is actually the input that you get from the eye. And people apparently traditionally thought that fruit flies really only see a blob resulting of this, because their processing of the data is so bad. But then people actually try to reconstruct this with a sophisticated neural network, and now people think that fruit flies actually can see some details and even discriminate different other fruit flies from each other, so it helps in their daily life. So the idea is that maybe string theory can also profit from machine learning in this sense and improve our vision on the string landscape. Also, in my own interest, I want to promote my conference that I'm organizing in Munich next year. This is a conference aimed at PhD students and postdocs, starting postdocs. This is in April, and last year we had a really exciting meeting in Brussels with many very interesting and high-level talks. So if you're yourself a PhD student working in the fields of strings, cosmology, or gravity, also holography and black holes, then you are invited to join our workshop here. And
2019.
Sorry, yeah, indeed, it's correct here. Yeah. Also, if you have some PhD students, this is mostly aimed at students in Europe, I must say. But yeah, you are cordially invited. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Daniel. Questions?